Great that you're all here. I've been thanking various individuals. They can accept my virtual thanks for all their help in doing this, including Amanda Anderson, including the staff of the Cogut, including Massimo Riva, who has partnered with us in bringing the roundup to Brown as part of the Cinema Ritrovato Festival. I believe this is our fourth collaboration, and long may it continue. And Massimo, I noted that you were very clear about who chose the film in your earlier remarks. I wonder why that was. Our three guest speakers today are noteworthy for the fact that they are all better known for their work on literary forms and in literary periods that are far removed from tonight's film. How did we even find them, you may ask? I'm not going to go into that. It was a very complicated process. Let me just introduce them briefly. Ágnes Matuska, am I saying your name correctly, is joining us from the University of Szeged in Hungary, located, if I'm not mistaken, in the Great Plain region of the south, where she is Associate Professor in the Department of English and also Vice Dean for International Affairs. I'm sure this is a great time to be Vice Dean for International Affairs.
Yes.
Exactly. Her primary field of research is actually English Renaissance drama, and her publications include essays on metadrama, on Shakespearean tragedy, as well as contemporary adaptations of Shakespeare. Her book, The Vice Device, Iago and Lear's Fall, as Figures of Representational Crisis, was published in 2011, and she has a co-edited collection, essays on the medieval period and the Renaissance, Things New and Old, was published in 2019. She's also co-editor of a Hungarian online journal called Apertura, with the subtitle Film, Visuality and Theory, and I guess that's where most of your film work, film energies are directed, Ágnes. To my immediate left is Benedek Kruchió. Am I saying your name correctly? Ben was born in Hungary, was raised in Austria, and is currently assistant professor of classics at Yale University. He specializes in Greek literature from the imperial period and late antiquity, and is currently working on a book called The Ethiopica of Heliodorus, Multiperspectival Narration and Ancient Reading Communities, which seeks to bridge the gap between formal analysis and discursive approaches to literature, a question that I think has intense relevance to this film. In previous lives, he has run cinema clubs in Vienna, Berlin, and Cambridge. He's published on Tarkovsky and has an ongoing interest in the reception of antiquity across film history. On the far left of the table is Stuart Burrows, Associate Professor of English here at Brown, he teaches 19th and 20th century American fiction and poetry, including the history of photography, as well as courses in European and US cinema. He's the author of two books, A Familiar Strangeness, American Fiction and the Language of Photography, and Henry James and the Promise of Fiction. Stuart also has ongoing scholarly projects on film. He teaches courses on Hitchcock and Tarkovsky, and a monograph underway that is partly on the work of Michelangelo Antonioni. So we're going to talk for 30 or 35 minutes and then open things up. I'd like to just begin by talking about the history of not just the history of this film, but also the historical dimension of the film. The roundup, this was said earlier, was made in 1965 and first released in 1966. In genre terms, we might say that it's a historical film. The setting is Hungary in the 1860s, a period of bourgeois reaction after the revolutionary period of the late 1840s. And we read in that opening tableau that the revolutionary spirit of 1848 has been wiped out by the Austrian imperial forces. It survives in a degraded form as banditry and criminality. We see the revolutionary leader of Lajos Kossuth. Is that how
Lajos Kossuth, right?
Would say that has been kind of vilified. But the film, there is this historical setting, but the film is also widely seen as an allegory of its own period, the period of its production. The director, Yang Shou himself, confirms this reading. The film was made 10 years after the 1956 revolt against the Soviets, led by Imre Nagy, amidst another period of reaction. So there's really a complex story of this film's own relationship to history that I think it would be a good thing to unpack. So maybe could I mean, there are there's two very discrete moments, really, the film's setting and then the moment of the film's creation. And maybe we could hear from both Benedek and Ágnes on those two dimensions initially. Ágnes, would you like to tell us a little bit about your thoughts about in particular, the 19th century setting of the film?
Yes, thank you so much. So indeed, these two historical layers are absolutely crucial. It seems to me that the two layers may be even understood as drawing the film's interpretation in different directions. So let's see what comes out of it. And in a way, it's almost easy to start thinking and talking about the historical setting, because at the beginning of the film there is this opening sequence with a narrator, and the narrator's voice seems to clearly explain what is going on. And he says this is the time of the rise of the importance of the bourgeois class, and then there are images shown about urban development, and it suggests that there is this moment of development, and then he says that almost suggesting that the flip side of this development is rural poverty, and then these drawings also change into not showing anymore the urban plans for new cultural, historically now important built monuments, but it shows the rural houses, and it starts showing tools for animal husbandry, and then it also shows these devices for torture. And interestingly, the title of the Hungarian title of the film is presented here in this context. And as Tim suggested, there is a reference to the 1848 Hungarian Revolution, and now it is the 60s, and the narrator suggests that the spirit of the revolution remained only with it says the Szegénylegények and the Betyárok, and Szegénylegények is the title of the Hungarian version of the film. It literally means poor young men. So it is the poor young men who are at the flip side of this rising bourgeoisie. But the betyár is used as a synonym for the poor young men, although the betyár, as it turns out also from the movie, it also suggests criminals. And it's interesting how the two are almost seamlessly connected when the meaning is not exactly the same. Szegénylegény, the poor young man, is also an important image for Hungarian folklore, because it's the szegénylegény, the youngest of the poor guys who will trick the devil, who will win the princess's hands at the end of the fairy tale. So there is a little romanticization around the term of szegénylegények. And the narrator also suggests that it is the real spirit of the revolution, which the narrator seems to be a little melancholy about, is not around anymore, but it lives with the perhaps romanticized poor young man. But there's this other element, namely the betyárs, which adds a little more nuance to that. So I can explain it more perhaps later about the Hungarian betyár Sándor, who was mentioned several times. They were looking for Sándor, they were looking for Sándor's men, and he was a renowned betyár of the period, a rogue.
But in a sense, has a kind of romantic patina attaching to him, right? I mean, he's an outlaw. He's a sort of Robin Hood type figure almost. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's interesting that he became one by the early 20th century. So he was such a well-known historical figure when he was imprisoned in Vienna.
And was active in the 1848 revolution?
Yes, but by the time he arrived to the 48 revolution, he asked for pardon from the Kaiser because he was a convicted criminal, but he was hiding. And then he, at one point in his life, decided that he would like to live a good life and asked for pardon, and the Kaiser didn't grant him pardon, but Lajos Kossuth did. And then he was allowed to organize a troop of horsemen in support of the Hungarian 1848 revolution. And this is a historical fact that indeed their military tactique was unique, and this is why it was also very successful, as it was also recreated in the film. But they didn't follow military orders, and then his troops were robbing around the southern region of Hungary, around the Serbian territories, so they didn't remain as one official part of the Hungarian Revolution.
One of the very fascinating aspects of this film as a historical film is that the big historical actors are not characters in the film. They're not present. Sándor is not present. Kossuth, of course, is long dead at this point. Is that right?
He's in exile.
So there are no identifiable actors of history, and yet they're omnipresent.
Also, there are songs that are being sung, or it is just the tune, but it is the tune for Kossuth song. So yes, you're right that he's not present, but as illusions.
Yes. Okay, thank you. This is very helpful. Maybe we should also turn to the moment of the film's creation and production. So 1966, 10 years after the revolt against the Soviet regime. Ben, maybe you'd like to say something about that aspect of the film.
Yes, with pleasure. So I had a bit of fun digging into the earliest reception of this film. There's interesting archival finds, early film critiques both in the East and the West, and also what Jančo, the director himself, had to say about this film. So around the time when the film was released in Hungary, Jančo gave two very high-profile interviews. One in which he emphasized that the point of this film was to present an anti-romantic bandit film that questions the sentimental and idealizing conceptions of the past and the Hungarian Revolution. Of course, this kind of stance really fits the agenda of the communist regime that is pushing to do away with any nationalist sentiment. And in another interview, he pointed out explicitly that, of course, his film has absolutely nothing to do with 1956. Now, of course, if you're a movie director in mid-60s Hungary and you're forced to give statements like this, you know you're in trouble, especially if what's at stake is whether your film can go to Cannes or not. We've already mentioned the kind of context of the 56 revolution, maybe, or failed revolution. Maybe one thing that's worth adding is that the Soviets suppressed this attempt at gaining freedom of Hungary by bringing in the Russian army. So tanks marched through Ukraine and Poland into Budapest. And by the way, maybe coincidence or not, that's exactly how 1848 ended as well. The Habsburgs brought in the Russians, often forgotten in history. But we're in the 1960s now, a time of what we tend to call goulash communism, and the time of consolidation after the traumatizing event of 56. Cultural politics at this time in Hungary were as liberal as for a long time never in Hungary, so it was possible to say much, much more than in the decades ever since the Second World War. There was a lot of political surveillance and a budding network of political informants, maybe also something we should keep in mind when thinking about the significance of this film. But filmmakers were permitted to make quite critical, also socially and politically critical films, as long as they didn't touch the big taboo subjects, two of which were 1956 and the influence and power of the Soviet regime in Hungary. Now that this film, Szegénylegények, had an indeed quite contested status in 60s Hungary, becomes even clearer if we, as I mentioned before, look at contemporary film criticism. The Hungarian media praised the film for its successful attempt at presenting a de-heroized alternative to idealizing historical narratives about this bandit culture of the 19th century. As one critic highlights, Jancsó reminds us that history is hard and uncomfortable at times. Maybe also something that could have something to do with the recent events, but of course from the opposite perspective than previously suggested. Interestingly, the contemporary émigré Hungarian media in France is from the first moment onwards convinced and very positively emphasizing that this film is a subversive allegory on 1956 and its informant culture and communist oppression. The stakes are high since this was a very, very successful film, not just on the international critical circuit, but also in Hungary. I found conflicting information, but it seems like somewhere between 1 and 2 million people saw this film in Hungary when it came out. We're talking about a population of 9.5 million people, so that's amazing. So this is what was the status quo in the 60s, but even with hindsight, it's quite interesting that the politics of this film are evaluated in strikingly contrasting tones. So this debate, whether this is kind of a reactionary film or one that is highly subversive, is still going on in especially Hungarian film scholarship to this point. And this brings me to kind of my last point, namely that I think this range of, and quite polarized state of interpretation of this film is closely related, I think, to the kind of potentially allegorical or parable-like significance of this film. Namely that it is, on the one hand, a historical story. It has a very specific historical setting. But on the other hand, much of this film forcefully gestures away from the specificities of that environment. How that happens formally and film analytically will, I think, address very soon. So I'm not going to go into details, but I think it is overall intuitively clear that this film gestures away from 1948 towards general workings of power, system of oppression, humiliation by the oppressing force. And the point of reference, which we then choose to link this film up to, is then up to the audience. And what's interesting, and this is my last point as regards the history of film in Hungary at this time, is that, and this is a point that I think confirms my instinct that all this that's going on as regards the kind of generalizing parabolical significance of this film has to do something with the specific political, cultural landscape in which it was made, is that this film becomes one of kind of the first amongst a row of Hungarian films made in this time that follow mutatis mutandis, this kind of very symbolical, allegorical mode of narration. So this film really brought something on the scene that both within the work of Jancsó and beyond found resonance and became the starting point for a new film language that is both kind of historicizing and clearly not that. And I think, to wrap things up, that this is best understood as a form of negotiating the tricky environment of socialist Hungarian cultural politics at this time that lived in a field of tension, on the one hand, between strict censorship. Film is still, despite all liberties possible to be taken, a state-sponsored and state-controlled business. And on the other hand, the kind of at least partially liberal cultural politics. So on the one hand, we have somewhat free artistic expression, but on the other hand, a highly an kind of hermeneutic environment that is characterized by deep suspicion, both on the kind of state side and on the audience side. As regards the party side, there is a strong paranoia against subversive undertones in anything cultural. So even the remotest of suspicion that a cultural product, a film, a book, could potentially be interpreted as something that is against party line could quickly marginalize an artist. And also, crucially, on the audience's side, because the audiences at that time are looking exactly for this, for these kind of remote resonances, find something that they can clinch to find kind of subversive elements in film. And I think this suspicious environment really incubates that kind of symbolical, allegorical mode of narration of filmmaking that this film represents. And what I think I'm most surprised by now, re-watching it, is that kind of it jumps onto the scene in such a kind of complete and fully formed nature. And then people take that as a springboard to work on this kind of very Hungarian-specific mode of filmmaking from then on until the mid-70s.
Thanks. It's incredibly illuminating to hear that contextualization of a fact about this film that I was really struck by as the film ended, which is it possible to pin an ideological position on this film? And it's actually true of every film by János that I've seen. It's very difficult to. He goes out of his way not to enable a kind of subjective perspective to be somehow celebrated or imagined or inhabited. So I think this really leads to the next question that we have to talk about, which is the formal qualities of the film, the techniques and the practices of János as a filmmaker. And maybe I could ask you, Stuart. I mean, Stuart, I know that we've talked a lot about film. You have a particular interest in off-screen space, off-screen sound. This is one of the very striking features of this film. Actions and events and even historical characters often appear out of sight, although sometimes they appear in our direct line of vision, shockingly and disturbingly. And it's not always clear what the rationale is for showing us a particularly violent event or not showing us one. So I wonder whether you might like to kind of just begin our conversation about these formal elements, the use of space, the use of movement, the use of sound, the framing, the use of framing in this film, the plane, the kind of omnipresent plane, contrasted with the fort. Stuart, what were your sort of thoughts about this?
Thanks, Tim. So I kind of want to talk about three things briefly, I promise. Off-screen space, as you say, I think, which is really fascinating. The fact that the camera never seems to stop moving in János's work, and the question of duration, which comes up obviously in this film in the most unbearable moments of the film when the woman is whipped. And so I don't want to talk about those three things. I mean, as I was preparing, I watched a whole. There were 6 different, obviously 6 films, János films on Canopy, which you can watch. And it's really kind of extraordinary to see how in each one he takes a historical event, whether it's the Russian Civil War or the Hungarian peasant revolt of 1890 or the lead up to the First World War. And then he creates a film that has the many kind of shared formal elements with the other films. As you said, Tim, the question, the off-screen, you have the fact that the historical characters are not present, which is, so you have a kind of thematic element to that. There's a great quote, actually. The description, the commentary, the John Cunningham commentary, which is on your handout, is really, really good, I think. And he says something which I think is true, which is, he says there's almost always a sense in this film, and I think in Joncho's work more generally, that something is happening off screen as the action moves back and forth across the frame, out of the frame, and back again. Now, most obviously, it's the fact that whether, this film is both claustrophobic and agoraphobic at the same time. It doesn't make a difference whether you're in the tiniest of spaces or you're on the plane, you are imprisoned. There's absolutely no possibility of escape, and therefore, it doesn't matter how far away from the fort you get, the horses, the cavalry will catch you up. So that's, there simply is no space outside of the prison space. So off-screen space is present in the sense that the whole world is a kind of prison here. Off-screen, wherever you turn, even when you're then a member of the army, even when you've changed places with your captors, you're still completely vulnerable. He often shows his characters addressing someone off-screen that we've not yet seen. Very early on in the film, the first man who's identified, we see the captain kind of nodding to him, and then we see the man, and that is something that Joncho repeats over and over again. You also have, often with those long shots, with that deep focus, you'll see something in the distance that is then going to completely change the kind of the theatrical tableau that we see. That's going to be completely changed by the appearance of that. So in this film, it would be the band, right? The band, it's the three men are chained, and it seems so. We wonder what the music is doing there. It seems so out of keeping. But they're announcing the fact that there is going to be all the other captors are then going to be incorporated into the army. So I think off-screen space works very strangely. I mean, you have the horses emerging from behind the camera, which is something so it's a very unusual use of off-screen. You have, one of the strangest moments for me in the film is, again, early on, the first man who's identified, that little pantomime when he goes into he works out which of the little prison, little cells, the doors open, he changes, it's pouring with rain, he changes his clothes, and it's dry. And his clothes are dry, and it seems like hours have gone by, but no time has gone by. And again, it's that sense that everything is a prison. It doesn't matter how much time has passed. It doesn't matter where you are. You're kind of in the same space. So that's extremely disturbing. The movement of the camera is related to that. In the first Joncho film I saw was about the Russian Civil War. It's called The Red and the White. It's an extraordinary film. And in that film, you see soldiers who are prisoners and then escaping, and then they rejoin their own force, and then that force is surrounded. And so suddenly the prisoners are, they're suddenly the guards, and the guards are the prisoners. So it's the same kind of dynamic that we see here, where at any moment you could be, there's no safe space. I think that's why Joncho always, at least every film that I saw, was about war, because you're always vulnerable. Whether you live or die is a matter of chance. The side you find yourself on can vary. There is, in a sense, no front line in The Red and the White, because everywhere is the front line, just as the fact that everywhere is a prison in the Roundup, everywhere is the front line in The Red and the White. It's simply where the camera goes. The camera's always moving, and you know that where the camera goes, kind of death will follow. It's as if the camera is, it's almost, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's producing that world, but it is implicit. That's why you had that sense, Tim, you're telling me, of, you feel somewhat, you feel as a viewer of this film, you're not quite implicit in it, but you do feel like you've been put through something. And there is a strong connection between the movement of the camera and the violence that inevitably ensues. And then finally, there's the question of duration. Joncho allows scenes to unfold in real time, which is very rare in the cinema. You almost always have time modified. Even someone going up the stairs and through a door, you don't actually see that in real time. There are tiny little cuts. But Joncho allows it's as if the movement of his camera and what he wants to show, he's allowing it to unfold in the time that it would have taken. And that has an odd sense that it almost makes things feel unreal, because we're so unused to experiencing real time in the cinema. And I think it's related to why he moves. I mean, a couple of times Ben used the word allegory, and I think it's because he moves in the direction of allegory. His later films, he makes a musical in 1972 called Red Psalm, which is about a peasant revolt. He makes a kind of ballet, Electra My Love, which is an adaptation in 1974, which is kind of extraordinary blend of dance and theatre. They're both allegories, but there seems to me, if you show things in real time, there's only you're not actually able to show that much, right? You're only able to show kind of a brief moments, and so therefore there's almost an inevitable sense that you're watching a kind of allegory if you're watching something in real time. In those films in particular, I really recommend Electra My Love. It's the most extraordinary adaptation. It is Sophocles, right? Is it Sophocles, Electra My Love? Always, yes. It's of Sophocles. That film is about fear. The Agamemnon's murderer, Aegisthus, says in that film, he says, it's the duty of a ruler to instill fear, just as we see fear as the kind of governing principle of the roundup. But the ruler is himself not exempt from this fear, says Aegisthus. Even if I were alone in this empire, I would be afraid, he says. I would be afraid of myself. And that to me seems like fear completely governs everything that's happening in the roundup. The fear of being identified, the fear of having to be the one who identifies someone, the fear that when the hood is taken off, what you'll see the worst thing imaginable. Even the soldiers, given the fact that we see the prisoners become soldiers, then we can assume that most of the soldiers we see would have themselves been through something of the same process. So fear is, and of course we do see a soldier stripped of his uniform. So you can, even when you're a soldier, just as the prisoner can become a guard, the guard can always become a prisoner. And so it's fear, I think, and it's fear instilled by that incessant movement and the sense that we're inhabiting the same time as the people on screen that makes it such a wrenching experience to watch his movies, I think.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stuart. I mean, it leads to, I think, really the last kind of question that I have for the panel before we open things up, and that really involves the film's depiction of power and the way that it operates as a kind of almost a pedagogy of oppression. This film, a pedagogy of the Andras Kovács-Balint calls the work an ornamentation upon the rituals of power. And the way that the film dwells, it's almost systematically upon the details in which power is imposed upon people. And I think this might be just something that I'd like to ask you all three what you might want to say about that, because it seems to me that this film uses power. Not only depicts a regime of power, but it almost imposes that regime upon us in its techniques and forms. We are ourselves. I mean, there's nobody to identify with in this film. We are confused and disoriented throughout the film, in the same way that the prisoners are. We get to know a character sort of moderately well, and then within a space of a few seconds, with no warning whatsoever, that character can be exterminated before our eyes. So it's a film about power, and it's what makes it so difficult to watch in so many places. So what really, maybe I could just ask you to all of you to sort of comment a little bit about the way in which power, the way in which this film is a lesson in the techniques and the operations of despotism. It's something that, of course, we're getting to know very deeply in our contemporary moment. What would you like to say about this question?
So maybe I can just continue with what I begin with, that 2D narration at the beginning, and then the change into 3D is just so powerful because the 2D version seems to give us an easy explanation. In the eye of the power, these poor men look as criminals. This is what the narrator says. So they are criminals in the eyes of the official regime, and they are freedom fighters in the eyes of the folk. And this is nice. So we have an ambivalence, but then this is 2D. And then when the film opens with the big Hungarian plane, it becomes big time 3D, and all the points of reference offered by the narrator instantly disappear. And
Jancho himself says at one point in one of the interviews, a late interview, the plane, if you look at it with its endlessness, should define freedom. Out there you can go as far as you can see, but even that isn't true. And then he talks about the scene in the opening where a character is said, "You may go," goes off into the plane, into the distance, and of course is shot a version of that image we see repeatedly. Ben?
Yes, just a specific observation connected to that point, something I didn't realize before about this film, but that really kind of jumped into my eyes when this screening wrapped up, probably because it was in cinema conditions, is that when we first see the kind of total of the newly recruited army lineup, the image very kind of straightforwardly echoes the very first shot with the outlines of the walls. It's the exact same geometric pattern, which with that kind of big diagonal in the bottom, the horizontal in the top, and then a second diagonal connecting the two. So basically what used to be the geometric formation of the wall, symbolizing being closed in, kind of morphs over the course of the film into the army that doesn't represent any more freedom. So the soldiers become the wall in a way. Maybe as regards questions of depiction of power, I think I might want to bring in your observations, Stuart, about the Jancho's insistent resistance to cut in this film, because cutting is manipulation. Cutting manipulates time, it manipulates our perception, and what we get in this film are very granular analyses of how people are manipulated by those holding power, but then it is all depicted without giving us the kind of opportunity to escape from the kind of sustained observation by just keeping the camera on. So I think the film creates analytical acuteness by resisting to do aesthetically what we see happening on screen in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, although there is that, of course, he does use the cut brilliantly with the man who's then has to spend, probably a night or who knows how many hours with the two corpses. And so there, because it's so hard to put, how do you show the lapse of time? And there it's simply a cut. It's brilliant. In terms of power, I mean, I think I would focus just on the very, very ending and the decree, the emperor's decree, because as you say, Tim, there are so many moments when they say you are free, and they're never free. They're free to walk 20 yards for being shot. But there, finally someone is freed, or someone is Sandor, and then it's the reaction, and then the use of the delay, right? You just wait, the men who've already identified themselves, then cheer, and that seals their doom, because then they've proven that they're still loyal to the rebellion. And so, it's the emperor's words, but he doesn't, no one else is free, only the man who may well be dead at this point, we don't even know. But it's that use, the emperor's decree of absolute power is because we've had all these tricks, all these psychological tricks, but there it's just simply, you just wait a few seconds and people expose themselves.
We were going to, at least I wanted to end the discussion on a bit of hope, but I'm not going to do that because we need to open things up. And so I'm going to look to the audience for a little bit of hope from this incredibly bleak ending of the film.
So it's just a thought, but I was struck by the treatment, let's say by the compartmentalization, does that exist, the word, of the space, which is very striking because at the beginning when you approach this apparently circular building, you have the impression that you could go around it, that somehow the camera movements will surround it, and that you will see the whole of it, and somehow have a kind of overview. But then, once you end up being taken into the plot, so to speak, even if there's no plot, there are only compartments. So there are cells, but even without speaking about the cells, you never exactly know where you are, why is there a wall, a door between exactly what and what. I found that very striking, and even in the outdoors, in the outdoor scenes, when you see the army, the cavalry, etc., you have the feeling that all these people, they form groups that perform exercises that somehow are disconnected, and they are looped on themselves, and they don't really relate to one another. So it's not really a question, but I was wondering, if you have any thoughts, if you were struck by this compartmentalization.
I mean, what has the sense of a film that has been rigorously choreographed? Doesn't one, Stuart?
It seems to it's the choreography, and as I said, because he went on to make a musical and a ballet that. But it's a choreography of power. I mean, I was struck by all the time he makes some. He makes some. What's his name? The guy who strangled in the end. It's
Goidor. Yeah.
Okay. He makes him wait right at the corner. He's not allowed to go round the corner. He waits there 3 or 4 times in the same space for no real reason. I don't know what he's not being allowed to see. There's nothing to see. But he's made to wait there, and it seems that it's always it's an imposition of power. You can be in this big space or this small space, or you have a hood. Why do the men have hoods? There's nothing to see. There's no. I mean, yes, a punishment, but there's. It doesn't seem that the hoods are necessary, really. I mean, yeah.
Well, of course, it abolishes individuality.
It abolishes individuality. That's true.
Makes it much more unbearable to just be there, as it is also reflected on. And this is what you also mentioned, how the audience feels viscerally the same humiliation that is reiterated in so many different ways, like with the hood. And then when it's taken off, then you see the most horrible side.
You see the most horrible thing, yeah.
So I wanted to point on that note to respond to Tim's request for a moment of hope that is in the film, with something that it doesn't feel like it, but it's an absolutely delightful moment, and it doesn't fit in anything else, and it's the moment when one of the 3 men asks to bathe, and he jumps into the barrel, and you worry that something awful is about to happen, and you can't understand why, again, the question of duration, why this is being drawn out, and then you really begin to relax and to really enjoy his movements, right? I mean, he's almost like a dolphin leaping around in the tiny space of this barrel. And so I was wondering about, those kind of moments, the way that they're pulling maybe on other genres, and so that's really the question I wanted to ask, right? What are the other genres that are being brought into this? Because just as we're constantly scanning the horizon or looking at these close-ups and trying to determine who is doing what to whom, who is going to sell somebody out, right? It feels sometimes like Westerns. There were bits that felt really like the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, right, with 3 characters who are kind of thrown together and who you feel are going to betray one another at some point. So I wonder if you could, especially to Hungarian experts, if you could talk a little bit about what are the genres that Jancsó is drawing upon for this film.
So I also had the Western association. Some of the shots from within that freestanding cubicle building kind of gave me the Searchers alarm. Don't ask me whether the Searchers was available in Hungary in 1965. But of course, even if we'd bring in the Western it would come as a negative, right? Because we don't have, horsemen coming from afar and bringing news. It's all seemingly free, but essentially hermetically sealed environment. I think, to me, what has been most prominent is what I mentioned before, the kind of ex negativo genre link to the idealizing historical fiction that was very, very popular up until the early 60s in Hungary. And I think when this film was being announced with its topic, that's what some people probably would have expected if they would go to see a film that is supposedly about 1848 and the following decades. Then they expect glorious battles, color and costumes, and they get it seemingly in one form, but not with the elements that you would expect from such a film. I'm afraid I have to push back slightly against your point of hope, the bathing scene. We were actually having this discussion before coming back in. What I was struck by was the glee of the captain who kind of tells him, "Oh, you want a shower, right?" And I think this is open to several ways of interpreting this scene, but I very much had the association, or the way I psychologized that, which is probably a mistake with this film in the first place, was that the soldier already knows that this is going to be his last one, and it's kind of the futility of the joy connected to getting clean the same day that you're going to be strangled to death with a bag over your head anyway.
I mean, on the question of genre, it's because he does move in different genres, musicals, war film. In The Red and the White is as great a war film as you could imagine. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary film. And this one, which is Western to a certain extent, and also almost like it's not quite a heist movie, but in the sense of like, what happens after when they're all selling one another out. But all through the genres, it's that it doesn't really matter whether it's a musical or ballet, or for Jóncsó, it's the threat of violence is so present. Anyone can, and it's the casualness with which people are killed is so shocking that I think there too that how could it not be about 1956 all the time, right? Because there's a sense of like it doesn't. When people could be singing and dancing or taking a bath and having, but that within 5 seconds, 10 seconds, they could be murdered, and so I think that's where you feel the pressure of those events of the outside continually.
One thing I didn't mention earlier was that Georg Lukács was a huge enthusiast for the film, and which was very surprising when I read the interview in which he was saying this. He refers to it as Jóncsó's Count Radé film. So Radé being the commissar who essentially, on behalf of the imperial forces, unleashed the regime of repression and retaliation in 1867. So Lukács is reading it as a historical film, and I wonder whether there is a dimension in which the mere fact that the film teaches us about the monstrous ways in which power is power is imposed upon people, the technologies of it is something that we could actually use as something to hang on to as a powerful motif of the film. But Ágnes, you were talking earlier on about the sea as something that we might want to think about, the image of the absent sea.
Yes, we were talking about the sea, and we actually agreed that the sea would be the potential for something else than just the mere horror. And this scene with the guy bathing just occurred to me now with the sea in my head. And I had had a different interpretation. So somehow I felt that the guard just felt that this was ridiculous from a human point of view, but nevertheless acceptable. So how fun that even in these oppressed and humiliated moments, one would want to take a bath. But, you know, this is absolutely no way to decide. But the sea comes in an interesting way, because clearly the Hungarian plane is a looming presence. And I was thinking what makes the film bearable for me at all. And I guess that the plane is not only the source of agoraphobia, but it's also something else. And I think the English version, the title of the English version, The Roundup, perhaps is good because it suggests that there is a larger context within which the roundup happens. And the larger context may be the authority, may be the official regime, but the Hungarian plane is not identical to that. So there is something more than that. And the birds chirping, somebody said that it was almost sinister, and for me it's exactly the opposite. So there is this power of nature, the power which is almost mystical, uncontrollable, and it's beyond the power that does the roundup. So, and we don't know what that is. And it's fearful perhaps as the sea, but also, and the sea is important because the Hungarian plain, the big Hungarian plain, which is called Puszta, the empty territory, historically, I mean, from looking at the history of Earth, it used to be a sea. It was called the Pannon-tenger, the Sea of Pannonia. And the territory is so rich for agriculture, specifically because it was a seabed. And when I was thinking of the importance, the symbolic presence of the Puszta there as something more than just the source of agoraphobia, I thought, well, it's the Hungarian Sea. And I actually identify with that. It's also, it has been romanticized, the Puszta, by Petőfi Sándor, the big poet of the Hungarian 1848 revolution. So there are so many different ways to look at it.
Maybe one thing that resonates with what you said about the birds is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the very first thing we hear after the prologue is the wind. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the first and only time, possibly significantly, that we have this kind of presence of nature in this artificial space.
And the rain and the sun, the shades.
And doesn't the camera itself remain really indifferent in a really kind of sublime way to the monstrous events that we're witnessing? I mean, there's a kind of, a kind of indifference. In other words, a sort of affiliation with something else that may be to do with these kind of natural elements. We also see birds, by the way, fly through the shot. Well, we just see shadows of birds that flying through a shot, and you barely catch it. It's usually when something horrific is going on in the foreground, and there'll be a sudden shadow of a bird will fly past towards the side. Well, I want to just thank our three guests enormously.
It wasn't Tim, I think it was another question.
Nacho, do you want to ask a question?
We have 2 hours.
Well, you can ask a very quick question.
Very quickly.
Or
So
make a
it's
very
just,
quick comment.
this was like a big Madeleine to me, this film. I saw it 30 years ago in Mexico. And the two things that caught my eye, and maybe, one is that my Latin Americanist comment, the cinematography strikes me a lot like Gabriel Figueroa, who's a great Mexican cinematographer from the 1950s, who definitely circulated in Eastern Europe. Yes. And all the way in which the framings of the open space of the plane, it looks a lot like Mexican cinema from the 1950s, so maybe that would be an interesting thing to look into. Alfonso Cuarón also cites Yangtze as a big influence of Children of Men and Roma. But the one that I was thinking, since we have experts on Hungarian cinema, that something I don't know, I just watched Bergmeister Harmonies, and there is a lot of the movement of the camera, the long takes, that really looks a lot like Béla Tar now, right? Yes. So if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between Tar and Yangtze, I would be very grateful to hear it.
Ben, surely you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything very substantial, but it is indeed the case that Tar uses every available opportunity to point to Jancsó as a major influence on his filmmaking. Tar says he's the greatest Hungarian filmmaker of all times.
Also,
And obviously the long shots are the most conspicuously adapted aesthetic element. And I would also say the use of the Pannon Puszta, so the plains, only in a very different way, because of course in Tar it's eternal rain and not dryness.
And then the sort of the refusal of Tar to ever provide us with anything like a point of view shot, right? It's just the camera, the movement of the camera itself is very Tar-like.
I guess I was actually, in some of the kind of longer portrayals of violence, I was thinking about the cat strangulation scene in Sátan Tango, which takes kind of painful 7-8 minutes, and all that happens is that a cat at the end ends up strangling, a child ends up strangling a cat.
Okay, thank you.
oh, there.
Thank you, Nacho. Lovely,
That's
lovely
our
moment to end.
hopeful.
It actually got worse.
Nice try. We tried.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Ágnes. Thanks for everybody
Thank
for
you.
staying.